this computer. All right, welcome to our study on 1 Corinthians. Today we'll look in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The first part of chapter 11 is verse 2 to 16. I have titled this the issue or the question of head coverings and in worship. There are people who have different titles, but I think this is maybe the most neutral title I can put without trying to slant it theologically one way or another. All right, this section is probably one of the most contentious section in understanding Paul. And in the last few years, there has been a lot of controversy, a lot of debate, and having to do with women and the authority or submission of women and things like that. Okay, so this is one of the more difficult and in terms of finding consensus, because a lot of questions and people have brought into this, and a lot of debate among women ministry, women leadership, and sometimes matters of marriage and the home, the relationship with husband and wife, all come into play with this, and people bringing questions and issues that are not actually addressed by the text, and try to make the text say something that is probably not intended to say. So we will look at some of those things and address some of them. But I think that it'd be good to just give an overview of this passage, what Paul is talking about. Okay, in chapters 8, 9, and 10, and Paul talks about and basically prohibit the Corinthian Christians from going to temple and with regards to eating food offered to idols. And even though it is talking about food of the idols, it is not just the food, but it is actually going to a temple feast. And the Corinthian Christians think that they should be allowed to do that, but Paul gives various reasons why Christians should not, and then he, as a kind of aside, then he addresses the question about eating food that have been sacrificed to idols that are sold in the marketplace. And he's basically say, when you go to the market, don't ask questions. And then he talked about private dinners, and also when you go for a private dinner, don't ask questions, just eat what is there, be grateful, and be happy that your friend invited you. So don't raise unnecessary questions. But if the question comes up, and perhaps for the sake of the other person, abstain, and so that but then he goes and says, food, whatever you do, and do all things with thanksgiving to God. All right. Now he comes to this section in chapters 11, chapter 12, and chapter 13, and chapter 14. This whole section has to do with worship. When Christians come together to worship, the first part of chapter 11 has to do with head coverings, particularly has to do with women, and having to do when the women wearing head coverings when they pray or when they prophesy. And nothing said about and they coming to church with head coverings, but whenever they pray and whenever they prophesy, they should have a head covering. That seems to be the first part of chapter 11. The second part of chapter 11 has to do with the problem of abusing poor people during communion service, and how the church has not been regarding proper conduct towards those who are poorer members of the church, and how they are abused in the celebration of communion services or during communion or Lord's Supper, which is more than just taking bread and wine, but actually is a feast, and when they actually a big makan when they come to church to do the Lord's Supper. And then chapter 12, 13, and 14, Paul deals with the question of speaking in tongues in church. Even though he talks about other things like prophecy, talking about love, but the whole problem has to do with speaking in tongues in church, and he deals with that issue. So this evening, we'd like to look at this issue about women having head coverings, and when they prophesy or when they come and do in worship in church in terms of prophesying and praying. And this is basically the issue. And it seems that some women in the church either are already doing this or arguing for the right and not to have head coverings and when they prophesy and when they pray in church, when they come together. And this is basically the whole question. And now the problem with dealing with this situation is that there are a lot of things that we do not know. We have no idea how exactly a church service is, and it takes place, and what actually people wear or people don't wear, and when they come to church. We don't know exactly the cultural customs and relating to men and women, and not only in church but also in the general culture. And so there are a lot of things we are not absolutely sure about. Then there's also the rather difficult and understanding Paul, and Paul's argument seems to be a little bit difficult, not for the Corinthians, but more for us. And because, I think Paul and the Corinthians probably had a shared understanding on several things, and the things that they know and share together is something that is not discussed. It's not something that's mentioned. And the things that they agree, and probably Paul doesn't need to talk about it. It is like sometimes like listening to the conversation on the telephone on one end, and you don't hear what the other person is saying. So and why Paul arguing and his situation in this way? And there's some of the argumentation is a little bit difficult to follow the logic of it. Okay. Then there are certain terms that Paul uses that are difficult and to be sure exactly what they mean. So there are a lot of what we call differences of opinion as to the meaning of several key terms. We will look at it afterwards. Okay, so but even though this matters are a little bit difficult, but the general trust of what Paul is arguing or saying or teaching in this is that there are women in the church that are disregarding the traditional practice of wearing head coverings as far as women are concerned. And for whatever reason, they are either discarding it or arguing for the right to discard it. And Paul, in the final analysis, is that we should not do something different. For he argues a number of arguments and says that the tradition and the what we call the practice of having head coverings for women should be retained in the churches, and because this is something that all the churches have, and they are no different what we call tradition that is in the other churches. So if anyone want to be contentious about it, want to argue about it, I'd like to let you know that every church that we know and have this practice, and so we should just follow it, right? Okay, with that said, probably the best way to begin on this is to read the text in a kind of structural display of the entire argument in a very purposeful and literal English, and so that we can it is something that is a little bit wooden and literal, so doesn't flow very well, but I think it is something that might be helpful. Okay, so let me share and the screen, and this is for my monitor, and okay. This is from Gordon Fee's commentary and on 1 Corinthians. It says the nature of these difficulties as well, that is some of the difficulties, and I think he mentioned that, and okay. This passage is full of notorious difficulties. Number one, the logic of the argument, uncertainty about certain absolute crucial terms, uncertainty about some prevailing customs in the culture in general, and the church in particular, the whole question of Christian worship. And Paul's response assumes understanding between them and him at certain crucial points. These matters are therefore not addressed. Thus, the two crucial contextual questions: what is going on and why? All right, is especially difficult to reconstruct. And all this further complicated by the resurgence in the 1960s, and after being later for about 40 years of our concern with women's rights, both within and outside the church. So many of the studies on this text in the decade preceding the first edition of this commentary, this is a second commentary, is a result of that movement. This is largely the debate in the Western society, not so much in Asia, but in the West, whole question about women's rights and things like that. So the nature of these difficulties, as well as the logic of Paul's argument, is best seen in this instance by a structured display of the entire argument in purposefully literal English. Capitalized head means that head is used in metaphorical usage, and literal head, and in small letters, and is literal. And I think I also try to help others a little bit by color coding it. So if it's metaphorical, it is in pink or red. Then if it's a kind of combined ambiguous, it is in green. And then if it is literal head, it is in yellow. All right. So now verse 2 begins. Now I praise you. Why? Because you remember me in all things. And even as I handed them on to you, you keep the traditions. But I want you to understand that the head, metaphorical, the head of every man is Christ. And man, the head, and the man, the head of the woman. And God, the head of Christ. Every man shames his head. Is then metaphorical as well as his own head. And praying or prophesying, having down against, the Greek word is having down against, probably referring to covering, and against the head. Every woman shames her head, metaphorical as well as literal. Prophesy, if you prophesy, pray or prophesy, uncovered as to the head. For it is one and the same thing for her to be shaved. For if a woman would not be covered, let her also be shorn, hair cut off. If it's grace for her to be shorn or shaved, then let her be covered. This is the first paragraph. Second paragraph, section, part of the argument is in verse 7. For on the one hand, a man ought not to have his head covered, being the image and glory of God. On the other hand, the woman is the glory of man. Why? For the woman is not from the woman, but woman from man. So, for also man was not created for woman's sake, but woman for man's. For this reason, the woman ought to have authority. This is a contentious word. And what does the word authority mean? Over her own head. And because of the angels. That is another, what have the angels to do with it? In any case, nonetheless, neither woman apart from man, nor man apart from woman in the Lord. Because just as the woman is from the man, so the man is also through the woman. But all things are from God. Then the third paragraph, judge among yourselves, is it fitting for a woman to pray to God uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that, on the one hand, if a man grows long hair, it is a dishonor to him? On the other hand, if a woman grows long hair, it's a glory to her, because the hair is given to her in place of a covering. And now he ends, now if anyone seems contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. All right. I'm not sure how then all this makes sense to you. Then, but reading it literally in this way, then you can see that the argument is a little bit difficult as to, and if you would read the NIV versions, and okay, I have done the same thing here. I praise you for remembering me in everything, and for holding to the traditions, just as I pass on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Okay, now let's begin with verse 2. Verse 2 is a very interesting and opening. And after then he says, and follow my example as I follow Christ. He starts with, I praise you for remembering me in everything, and for holding traditions just I pass on to you. But if you look down, and even immediately in the section, that Paul isn't really praising them for anything. Okay, and so what is it doing? And later on, he does say, and in the following, I have no praise for you. So there are a number of things that then we probably need to say about this, and something that Paul is being sarcastic, been ironic. I praise you, and as if but there doesn't seem to be that kind of a sense, I think. And I think probably the best way to look at it is that Paul uses this and as a kind of attempt to establish some kind of a goodwill not hypocritically, not rhetorically just, but probably there are things that he praises them, and there are things that Paul can be thankful for. Just as in the beginning of the letter, he does plan. He said, I praise you for remembering me in everything, Okay. Whether they agree with him or don't agree with him, they remembered. And Paul says, I thank you, I praise you for remembering me. Okay. And then for holding traditions, just as I pass on to you. And the word traditions is in the plural. And so he's not just talking about, probably he's talking about some of the traditions or many traditions. And so there are many traditions that Paul has given, but there are certain traditions he does not, and seem to be praising them for, especially already in verse 3. But, okay, so I praise you for remember everything, but holding traditions have passed on to you. So this is a general statement, an overall general statement. I thank you, I praise you for remembering me, and for holding on to the traditions I've given to you. But, and this but here is his attempt to correct it. Okay. Now, some have noted, and I think Gordon Fee has noted, that in this particular section, Paul doesn't seem to be that forceful in his argumentation. This has to do with head covering, and Paul is not that agitated. You find that he is not strongly and impassioned about this, not so passionate. For him, it is not probably a very big thing. And unlike what you will have to when he comes to taking communion and the whole question about the Lord's Supper, and when you are, and there you find that you can sense his anger a little bit more. And but this one, he's kind of quite mild. I want you to realize, and I just want you to be aware. And so it's a kind of very mild correction. But why is Paul doing this? Probably Paul is not so much concerned as to whether they have head coverings or not have head coverings, but Paul is more concerned with the underlying reason why some women, I think it has to do with some women in the church, they're insisting on not having head covering. And if there's a question of preference, and Paul probably then would be so much agitated, and he can allow for some kind of what we call charity on that. But the reason why some of them are going on this is where probably he feels that he needs to make some correction on it, and then he then comes on that. So you'll find that then Paul's passion on this matter is not as great. All right. Now, and verse 3 is where we come and face the first basic problem interpretation. And especially when modern people read, especially when we have certain conservative Christians, overly conservative Christians who read this and interpret it on something that I don't think Paul is really talking about that. So he says, I want to realize the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And this is definitely metaphorical. This has to do not with the physical head, but this has to do with the symbolic understanding of the head. And what many conservative Christians, and probably you have heard this most of the time, and traditionally, this has been interpreted in recent times, and the word head is authority. Okay, so the head, that means the authority of every man, is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Some even then read this differently, and the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the wife is the husband. Okay, I think NIV. Of the head of the wife is a husband, and the head of Christ is God. Someone to bring in the whole family status here. But there's nothing about marriage here in the text. Okay, Paul is talking about public worship. And even though in the Greek, the word man could mean husband, and the word and woman can mean wife. To read husband and wife here is a little bit, I would think, unnecessary, and is reading into the text something that is not there. The head of every man is Christ. What does it mean the head of every man is Christ? Who is this every man they're talking about? And how is Christ the head of every man? Two possible options here that this could be something general, that every male, every man that is on this world and is created and by God through Christ. So God created everything in Christ. That is possible. However, in verse 4, it says, every man who prays and prophesies. And when we find verse 4, it's not talking about every man. The assumption is that every man here who prays and prophesies with his head and covered, he's talking about Christian man. So a better understanding when he talks about this is that the head of every man and is every Christian man in that sense. And then the head of the woman and is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, the whole problem has to do with understanding of head. What does it mean, head? As I said, many pastors and scholars, preachers, Bible commentators, thinks that the word head means authority. But actually, for the Greek audience, and for a person who is a native Greek in Paul's time, head, the Greek word is kephale, all right? This word, kepala, okay? In Malay, the word here is kephale, kephale, kephale. The Greek word kephale, head, okay? And to say that is a hierarchical meaning, the head over somebody, is not the primary sense of the word head in Greek, okay? In Hebrew, the word rosh could mean authority, chief, and could also mean literal head. And every time that the word authority is being used, and like a chief, and the Hebrew word rosh is never translated as kephale. It is translated as arche, and the chief, okay, rather than head. Because the head has to do more like the source or the origin. What we call, rather than head of the department, that is the chief of the department, but what we call the head rivers, and what we call the head of the rivers, the source of the river. And basically the head is where the source comes. And the origin, the headwaters, what we call it. And so in largely the Greek and sense, for the Greek audience in the ancient, during Paul's time, head literally means and source or origin, okay? Now, this debate has been going on because there are political agendas in everybody on that, and it is hotly debated. And you will find that many will insist the word head means authority, but I don't think so. Here, Paul is talking about relation, and rather than hierarchy. Okay, so the head, the source of every person, every man, whether it is an of Christian or universal, is Christ. Christ is the source. And so whether you talk about creation or whether you talk about new creation, say it is through Christ. And the head of the woman, the source of woman, in a general sense. He's not talking about husband and wife. He's talking about generically the whole universe kind of thing. And he's referring to the creation story. Later we'll find that the creation story is again mentioned. That when in Genesis 2, God created man first, and then man was alone, and then God took from man, from his side, a rib, and from there created the woman. So the source of the woman is the man. And the source of Christ, and here is probably referring to incarnation, rather than some kind of eternal generation and that in the inner life of the Trinity, but Christ comes from God. So God is a source of Christ in the incarnation. So this is what I think it is. But the problem with this verse is that when Paul talks about this, then the head of every man is Christ, head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God, he doesn't explain it. He just left it there. Later on, you find that there's no real explanation as to this kind of thing, and everything is just left it there. And so we cannot be absolutely sure what he is talking about. And although I think that the idea of that this is the source of man, every person, every man is Christ. Christ is the source, is the origin of every man. And the head of woman, and in creation story is the man, and then the head of Christ incarnation is God. I think this understanding fits better Paul's argument, and as he develops it, and rather than trying to talk about that the authority, the headship of man is Christ, and the headship of woman is man, and the headship of God, of Christ, is God. I think that is, to me, a little bit foreign to Paul's understanding. So now Paul says, so every man who prays and prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Why? And he does explain. Somehow he dishonors his own head and also dishonor the metaphorical head. But every woman who prays and prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman doesn't cover her head, she must well have her hair cut off. But if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or a head shaved, then she should cover her head. Okay, and I think verse 6 probably then and if a woman doesn't cover her head, she must well cut off her hair. For if it's a disgrace for a man to have a hair cut off or head shaved, then she should cover her head. Modern people find it probably very hard to say. Where is the logic in that? But whatever it is, and Paul is saying that a man who prays with his head dishonors his head, covering his head, and brings shame. It's the whole idea about shame, and so a man who prays or who prophesies with a head covering. Again, the word covering here then doesn't then have to do with the word and a kind of a veil over the face, but over the head is a kind of a shawl and over that. And although this a man who prays with a prophet with his head covered, dishonor his head, that seems to be the understanding. Okay, Paul is not arguing this. He's just stating the fact. He's just stating that is something that they probably don't all agree. Okay, and verse 5, they may not agree. Okay, then but a man who prays with his head covered dishonors his head. The problem is that later in Jewish history, and we find that even in modern Jewish and practice, is that Jews, devout Jews, cover their heads when they pray. They don't cover their heads when they preach or when they prophesy, but they do cover their head. So if you go to Jerusalem, those of you who went to Jerusalem, in what we call in the prayer in the Wailing Wall, the men will cover their heads, or they will wear a cap. So when I went to Jerusalem and then when we went to pray, so the men, we all have to wear a cap to cover our head. So that, but in Paul's day, it seems that a person who prophesies or prays with head covered or covering of the head dishonors his head, both metaphorically and literally. Okay. Now he explains why. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God. Okay. The key is more has to do with the glory of God. Okay. So he should not cover his head because he is and the one that is God's image, and also bring honor. Glory has to do with honor. He glorifies God and his head. So then his head glorifies God because his head symbolizes God, and the head and his head, God is his head. It's interesting. Then he's not talking about Christ now. He's talking about God. So in verse 3, he said the head of every man is Christ. But now he says that he'll not cover his head, but his head, then he's the glory of God. And so he should not cover his head because he reflects God's glory, even though, and also his image. Then in the second part of the verse, he says that the woman is the glory of man. Now, it's very important what he doesn't say. He doesn't say that the woman is the image of man. No, because men and women are made in the image of God. Okay, and so here is a little bit why, because man did not come for a woman, but a woman from the man. Nor was the man created for a woman, but woman for a man. Okay, so the idea is this: God created man out of the dust, and from the dust, and so he honors God, and he basically then is the glory of God, and fully God should be honored for that. But God created the woman from the man. So the woman is the glory of man. See? And one way to look at this is that, then man was not complete. God saw that man was alone, and he is somehow incomplete, and God created animals, and so the woman completes the man, and so the woman is the glory of the man. And he honors, and so the woman is the glory of the man. And so in worship, that basically the woman then in glory is towards the man. But when you come to worship, when you come to pray, and a prayer and worship is to glorify God and to honor God. So a man should not cover his head, because to cover his head is to dishonor God, is to hide the glory of God. But the woman should cover her head, because her head and so in a sense and reflects man and man's glory, and so man's glory should not be seen in the worship of God, and so there's a necessity to cover, and that seems to be what he's saying, because the man did not come from the woman, but the woman from the man. For man was created, neither was man created for the woman, and for the woman for the man. Then in verse 10, we come to one of the most obscure, most debatable, and most a difficult verse. For this reason, a woman ought to have authority over her own head. And then we have even more problem because of the angels. What is going on here? Now, I think Gordon Fee has pointed out, and if you follow the logic and of this verse, a man not ought to cover his head, and then but a woman should cover her head. So and a man ought not to cover his head, is the image and glory of God, but a woman is glory of God. For a man did not come from woman, but a woman neither from man. Neither for a man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, a man ought to have a covering over her own head. Okay, that's what we expect. But he doesn't say that. He says that a woman ought to have authority over her own head. Huh? What's going on here? Okay, now let me share the screen here. Okay, all right. Okay, the ESV translate this as, that is why a wife, again, I don't know where they got a wife there, a wife ought to have a symbol of authority over her head, on her head. That means she's a symbol of a husband's authority. They're understanding that. So if I read the ESV, so single women do not need to have that symbol, but married woman ought to have that. And so a very kind of interesting kind of a reading. The Net Bible, and for this reason, a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head. Okay, a symbol of authority. What that symbol of authority is, and New Living Translation. For this reason, and because the angels are watching, a woman should wear a covering on her head to show that she is under authority. Okay, kind of interesting, isn't it? And but basically, if you read the Greek, is that a woman ought to have authority over her head because of the angels. So the NIV and translate this reason. For this reason, the woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Now, all of a sudden, we find this word authority. What is this authority, so to speak? And this is the only time the word authority is found in this whole passage. So probably because of this, people read back into this whole situation, and basically talks about the head has to do with authority. And some would translate the word authority as a symbol of kind of passive way, a symbol that she's under authority. But authority doesn't mean to be under authority. Okay. There is no way in all of Greek and that the word authority means to be a symbol that you are under authority, and that is a very, very unusual meaning to be attached to this phrase and to this word. So the idea that the woman should wear a veil or a symbol that she is under the authority, or a wife should wear, I think is something that's very foreign to the text. It is not to show that she is under authority. And okay, why? I don't see how, and it fits. The other way is that a woman should have a symbol of authority. That means they will take it as authority, that the veil becomes a symbol that she has authority to prophesy and to prophesy and pray. But again, how does that work? If she doesn't have a head covering, she doesn't have authority. And but she has a head covering, she has authority to prophesy. Again, that is a little bit difficult, and I don't understand how it works. And even though it has caused us problems, and as far as the flow of logic is concerned, I think Paul is basically saying, for this reason, a woman has authority over her head. She has authority to decide what to have. She has authority over her own head. Okay, and probably it is Paul's using this is not so much his own initiative, and that probably phrase comes from the women in the church. They have the authority, and Paul is agreeing with them, so to speak. Yeah, you have authority over your head. However, by having authority over head, and you should exercise the authority in the proper way. And Paul makes sure that you have authority by wearing a veil. You have authority. You have authority to decide whether to wear or not to wear, but you should exercise the authority responsibly and properly and appropriately by wearing a veil, and because of the angels. And again, the angels reference is a little bit strange. Why angels are being raised, and there are some very weird and very interesting but weird ideas there. And some was one very common popular understanding is that the angels has referred to male angels, and they are involved with worship, so women should have a veil, and because otherwise he'll distract the angels and seduce the angels, so to speak, and referring to Genesis chapter 6. That is a very weird kind of a thing. With angels are neither male nor female, and why would angels be seduced and things like that? Then the others have to do with angels are the guardians and the watchers, not only the universe, but also, and they are the keepers of proper worship in that. And well, that could be then possible, but again, for me, find a bit weird. I think the whole idea of the angels here has to do and with the whole problem with the women in the church, and or the understanding that the women believing that they are really angels. Okay, and they are people who has already attained perfection. They are like angels in heaven, and they are kind of genderless. Then they're like angels. I think Paul is saying that they should have authority, and when the authority decide, and the proper way to exercise authority is to wear a covering, because the angels is to show that even though we have now in Christ, and there's neither male nor female in Christ, but we are still in the process, it's still a situation of not yet there. And gender distinctions, sexual distinctives is still to be maintained in this world. That there is, in this present world, part of creation, part of God's creation, part of God's order, when men and women are still men and men, women are women, and not to try to erase that distinction. And the distinctive head covering is to maintain that kind of a distinction. Okay, and yes, the woman ought to be then have authority. Nevertheless, and here he qualifies it in verse 11. In the Lord, a woman is not independent of man, nor is the man independent of woman. So in verse 12, for as woman came from man, referring to the creation story, even as Eve was created from Adam, man is also born of woman. So there is no what we call priority. There is no who is first and who is second and all that. And then they are not independent of one another either. And a man is not independent, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman, but there is a relationship and in the Lord. But everything comes from God. So in final analysis, is neither men first or women first or whatever it is. And there is still a difference, but there's equality. And in final analysis, everything comes from God. And then the last section of the Paul's argument, and how he just basically then appeal to the sense of propriety. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Okay, well, some would say, why not? But he argues, doesn't the very nature of things, and the sense of appropriateness doesn't teach you the nature of things that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him. This is a very cultural thing. Long hair is not something that men should have. And I can still remember my mother when I kept my hair long, so, must cut your hair, must cut your hair, must cut your hair. And somehow, long hair, there's a natural sense, or in church, and when my hair becomes a bit long, then the members in the church say, Pastor, I think you need a haircut. And or they never say that you need to tie your hair, you need a haircut. Doesn't the nature, if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace. But if a woman has long hair, it's a glory. So woman, long hair is something very appropriate. For long hair is given to her as a covering. Okay, and so in that sense, it's already a covering. Long hair is a covering. That is so. By way of analogy, a woman ought to have a covering a shawl. And then in verse 16, he says, if anyone will contentious about this thing, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. And now, I think I get a sense that Paul is not so invested about the whole question of head coverings, and it's a cultural thing, and it should not be something that should be argued overly much. There are good theological reasons, good cultural reasons to maintain the practice, and women should continue to have that head covering. And then, but he admits that women have the authority, have the right to decide what to have on the head, and or not to have on the head, and they have the authority. But because of this consideration, she ought to have, and so Paul largely ends with that. Say, okay, let me. I think so. In the final analysis, and I don't think it is, and try to read into this text hierarchy of men over women, husband over wife, and but largely the appropriateness of having head coverings in the Corinthian situation. Now, today, how does it apply to us? I think that we are not meant and to take this literally, and therefore women should wear and veils and or shawls and in worship, because we don't do that. Okay, in our culture, that is not part of that. Although in certain cultures it is. When we have we used to have two Pakistani a Pakistani family that worship in our church, and they then the wife and the daughter, when they come to church, they always wear a shawl, and that's fine because that is the cultural practice. But for most of us, we don't do that. There are some, like the Brethren Church, insist that you have a veil, wear a shawl over your head, and insist that is biblical teaching. I don't think that, because if I wear veil, I think that we only bring attention to something that is not necessary. I think the thing that we can take from here is this: then Paul is saying that there are a number of things that he's saying, that maintain the cultural practices where you are, don't change. And then he also arguing that some people who are changing the cultural settings, and for certain what we call questionable reasons, and the Corinthian women are throwing off the veils to show that they are equal to men, and or they are, and no, they have arrived, and that is a very questionable theological reason for doing that, and probably that's the reason why Paul argues against that kind of a thing, and basically uses theological arguments that they are on the wrong track. But he proposes that they should just continue to practice because that is a custom of our churches. But today, that is not the custom of our churches. But what we can probably take away from this is that in the modern era, in our modern culture, contemporary culture, there's still that element that men are men, women are women, and we are equal, and there's nothing to do with headship in terms of authority and things like that. The headship has to do with a narrative that man was created first, women was created then, and there is kind of a sense of relationship. But in Christ, we are neither independent of one another. But to try to erase that distinction, that to have men dress as women and women to dress as men, or to try to have some kind of a unisex kind of a dress code, androgynous kind of dress code, to try to erase the distinction between men and women is something that's not appropriate to the gospel. It's something not appropriate to God's word or to God's creation. So men should wear what is appropriate to men when they come to church to worship. Women should wear what is appropriate to women when they come to church to worship. So this has to do with keeping the proper distinction between men and women, even though there's neither male nor female in Christ, but that God has created us men and women, and we should honor that, and we should keep that as a distinction, that women should not behave like men and men should not behave like women, and especially when it comes to church and worship, and try to do that. All right. The problem in Corinth is not so much that the men were trying to behave like women, but the women was trying to behave like men. And Paul says there's no necessity of doing that. And to try to do that is probably wrong-headed, because already in Christ we are equal. And although there is a historical, there is also what we call the sense of creation, that man was created first before Eve. But then, ever since then, every man comes from woman. But then men and women are not independent of one another, but all belongs to God. So then Paul is using that kind of argumentation. So the whole question has to do with appropriate head covering, and in the Corinthian situation, and we want to apply today is appropriate and dress code, and in terms of gender distinctives, and rather than having head covering or not having head covering, and in that sense, in the Jewish culture today, when the men prays and they have the shawl, or they have the cap, women are not allowed to have that. Women are not allowed to wear the cap when they go to the Western world to pray. Yeah, that will be an offense. And so culture changes and culture has different meanings. So what we do culturally, the understanding of the culture, and what, as I say, and why, and we are changing cultural norms, and is more important as far as Paul is concerned. So as Paul is concerned, these Corinthian women are trying to say something that Paul finds disturbing, and therefore Paul clamps down on it. But Paul is not as invested and in that kind of a situation as we will find that he's invested in the problem of the rich abusing the poor in the Lord's Supper. Okay. All right. Let's stop the recording, and then those of you who have questions.